Imagine being just strapped into an airplane.
Yeah.
And you are flying around the globe for like 9 days straight.
Right. And obviously not for a vacation.
No, completely the opposite. You are desperate, you're exhausted, you've been wearing the exact same clothes for over a week.
Yeah, just an absolute nightmare.
Exactly. You land at international airport after international airport. You walk up to the immigration counter just begging for entry.
And every single time they look at your paperwork and they violently push you back onto that same plane.
Because, according to the administrative architecture of the world, you mathematically do not exist.
Yeah.
You're pushed back into the sky, totally locked out of the human system.
Just a harrowing image.
It is. And today, we are looking at a text that argues this kind of situation isn't just a bureaucratic glitch. It is the literal earthly definition of hell. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, we are getting into some really heavy structural concepts today.
We really are. So what is the source we're unpacking here?
Well, we are looking at a transcribed lecture from December 1979, delivered by a scholar named Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Okay.
And he is analyzing a very specific section of a foundational text, Surah As-Sajdah, verses 20 through 30. But, what makes this analysis so fascinating is that he completely strips away the mystical theological fog that we usually associate with ancient texts.
Wait, hold on. Let me just challenge this premise right out of the gate, because I think a lot of you listening might be having the same reaction.
Sure, go for it.
For centuries, billions of people have read this specific text, and texts like it, as literal post-mortem theology. They read it as a description of what happens after you die. Heaven, hell, angels, divine wrath, all of that.
Right, the traditional Orthodox reading.
Yeah. So are we really saying that an entire civilization has just fundamentally misunderstood its own foundational blueprint? Like, how does Parwez justify stripping away the afterlife component entirely and replacing it with, I don't know, socio-economic theory?
I mean, that is the core friction of this entire analysis right there. Parwez isn't necessarily denying the existence of an afterlife, but he vehemently argues against reading these specific sociological patterns as purely, post-historical.
So he's saying these aren't just spooky stories about the end of time.
Exactly. His justification is rooted in the actual language and the structural logic of the text itself. When you look at the Arabic vocabulary used in these verses through their classical root meanings.
Before all the centuries of feudal and imperial dogma got layered over them?
Exactly. Before all of that. When you strip that away, you do not find a description of a mystical temple. You find a laboratory.
A laboratory, wow.
Yeah, you find a highly sophisticated, unforgiving manual on systems engineering. He argues that this text is outlining a universe governed by a very strict consequence system.
A consequence system. So we're talking about cause and effect with absolutely no override button.
None.
Zero. There are no intercessors to save you, no lucky charms, no VIP passes based on who your parents are.
Right. It's pure cause and effect.
Yeah.
Think about it like the laws of physics, right? Gravity really does not care if you consider yourself a morally righteous person or a terrible person.
If you step off a cliff, you are going to fall.
Exactly. The physics engine of the universe just executes the outcome of your action. And Parwez argues that Surah As-Sajdah maps out a sort of socio-economic gravity.
Socio-economic gravity. I like that.
Society either aligns its operating principles with human dignity, equitable resource distribution, and, objective reason, or it mathematically crashes.
Okay, so let's actually test this theory against the text itself. Let's start with that concept of hell that we opened the deep dive with.
Right, 20.
Right. Verse 20 states, and I'm paraphrasing here, as for those who defiantly disobeyed, their refuge is the fire. Every time they wish to emerge from it, they will be returned to it.
And the traditional commentaries, the tafsirs, they paint a very visceral picture here.
Oh, yeah. Very literal. A burning pit, physical chains, people trying to, physically scale the walls only to be struck down by supernatural wardens.
Which is terrifying. But you have to admit, it's safely cordoned off in the next life.
Right. Which is incredibly convenient for anyone running an oppressive system in this life.
Exactly. If the ultimate punishment is deferred until after you die, tyrants and corrupt elites can operate with total impunity right here, right now.
Don't worry about the fact that you're starving now, you'll get yours later. That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But Parwez completely reframes this structurally. He points out that the defiantly disobedient in this context are not people who just, missed a ritual prayer or something.
Okay, so who are they?
They are those who actively rebel against the productive laws of societal alignment.
Mhm.
People who engineer a society based on exploitation, artificial division, hoarding resources.
So they're building a structural trap.
Yes, an earthly structural trap. The fire is the living hell of a misaligned society. Poverty, systemic violence, extreme inequality, the total collapse of trust.
And what about that crucial phrase, the one about every time they wish to emerge from it, they will be returned to it?
Well, according to Parwez, that is a precise technical description of a system operating in persistent, fatal misalignment. You cannot escape a toxic socio-economic system by simply wishing to leave it.
You can't just think positive thoughts to get out of poverty.
Exactly. Or by making a brief, singular corrective gesture.
Okay, let me bring in a software architecture analogy here because I feel like it maps perfectly to what you're saying.
Go for it. Let's hear it.
So in coding, if you have a foundational flaw in your code base, say you've got a massive memory leak or a fatal logic error at the root level, you can't just slap a new, pretty user interface on the app and expect it to run smoothly.
Right, because the foundation is still rotten.
Exactly. The system is fundamentally broken. So every single time the program tries to execute a core command, it mathematically hits that foundational error and crashes back to the start. It gets caught in a fatal loop.
A fatal loop. That's a great way to put it.
Isn't this text basically saying that a society cannot exit a state of suffering without rewriting its fundamental code? Like, the pushing back into the fire isn't angry angels with pitchforks. It's the system returning a fatal error.
That is an incredibly sharp way to look at it. You cannot just hit Control-Z on a systemic failure while the hard drive is physically melting in front of you.
Yeah, you have to replace the hardware.
And to really illustrate this earthly fire and the impossibility of emergence, Parwez brings in the concept of global geography.
Okay, how so?
He contrasts the original expansive design of the Earth with the artificial enclosure that human beings have engineered. The Quranic text frequently describes the Earth as a mustakar.
Mustakar. What does that mean?
It translates to a spacious, secure dwelling place meant to sustain all of humanity. In your software terminology, it was designed as an open-source platform.
An open world where humanity is meant to operate as a single, integrated organism. No paywalls, no geo-blocking.
Exactly. But look at what human systems, specifically modern political nation-states, actually did with that open platform.
We carved it up.
We drew arbitrary, invisible lines across the dirt. We erected barbed wire. We built militarized zones. We invented these rigid administrative concepts of passports, visas, and exclusive national identities.
Right. You belong here, you don't belong there.
And Parwez argues that these borders have successfully turned the Earth from a sanctuary into a segmented prison. A geographical territory literally becomes an enclosure.
So if you are born on the wrong side of an invisible line, you are locked into that zone's specific flavor of suffering.
You are. And you literally cannot step an inch past that line without the global administrative system violently rejecting you.
Which brings us right back to the woman on the airplane from the intro.
Yes. Her name was Ranjan Vaid, though some press reports at the time called her Ranjan Devi. Parwez was giving this lecture in 1979, right? So he grounded this theoretical concept in a chilling empirical reality from earlier that same decade.
This was the 1970 geopolitical crisis in Uganda and Kenya, right?
Right. Exactly. And we really have to understand the mechanics of that crisis. Due to shifting regimes and aggressive new nationalist policies in those countries.
Like the Africanization policies.
Right. Thousands of non-citizens, particularly individuals of South Asian descent who had lived there for generations under British colonial rule, were suddenly stripped of their livelihoods, stripped of their rights.
Just overnight.
Literally overnight. Because of incredibly complicated loopholes in British overseas citizenship laws, they became effectively stateless.
That is the ultimate system crash for an individual. The system looks at you and essentially says, error 404, human not found. You just don't compute anymore.
And Ranjan Vaid found herself right in this bureaucratic abyss. Desperate to escape this earthly hell, she managed to secure a flight to England. She genuinely believed her British overseas passport would grant her entry.
Because logically, it should have.
But when she landed in London, the immigration system rejected her. She had no valid visa, no recognized right of abode. She hit the fatal error in the code.
So what do?
They pushed her back onto a plane. And over the course of 9 days, she traveled an estimated 70,000 miles.
70,000 miles. Just wrap your head around that. That is almost 3 times the circumference of the Earth.
Bouncing from airport to airport, she landed in Geneva, Frankfurt, Rome, Bombay, and at every single port, the national systems rejected her.
The psychological horror of that is just difficult to process. Being treated not as a human being, but as a corrupted data packet being endlessly bounced between servers.
And the source notes she lived on scraps of airline bread. She was unable to sleep, locked entirely out of the human ecosystem.
And where did the system ultimately deposit her?
She was pushed right back into the nightmare she originally fled. She was returned to Kenya, where she was immediately jailed upon arrival.
Unbelievable.
Parwez points to this event and says, look, this is verse 20 in physical action.
Every time they wish to emerge from it, they will be returned to it.
Yes. Ranjan Vad tried to emerge from the fire of a misaligned, hyper-nationalist society, but the global architecture of borders and exclusion violently returned her to it. It is not a myth about the afterlife. It is the brutal administrative reality of a fractured world.
The source also mentions the Vietnamese boat people, which was a crisis unfolding right around the time he delivered this lecture, wasn't it?
It was. In the late 1970s, following the Vietnam War and the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, hundreds of thousands of people took to the open seas in incredibly fragile, overcrowded fishing boats.
Trying to escape political persecution, re-education camps, mass execution.
Exactly. But as they approached the shores of neighboring, supposedly civilized nations, places with resources, places with space, they were refused entry.
The borders stayed shut.
The historical record shows that sometimes these boats were actively pushed back out into the open, treacherous ocean by maritime border patrols. In some horrific instances, they were deliberately sunk.
Oh my.
People were left floating for days, pushed back into the jaws of death, because no sovereign nation would update its code to include them.
Consider the implications of this for a moment. Just really think about it. Parwez is arguing that borders, passports, immigration quotas, all the things we accept as normal, completely necessary administrative tools, are actually symptoms of a deep structural disease.
We have artificially constructed a world where the earth is no longer a sanctuary.
We built the fire ourselves, we are fueling it with our factionalism, and we are heavily guarding the exits.
That is the inescapable conclusion of this segment of the text. When you divide humanity, when you hoard resources behind arbitrary lines and prioritize tribal identity over human dignity, you engineer a system of suffering.
And once that massive infrastructure is entrenched, it traps everyone within it.
Everyone.
Okay, so that clearly establishes the nature of the trap.
Yeah.
The system is misaligned, and people are caught in the loop. But, I mean, surely a civilization doesn't just wake up one Tuesday in a state of total fatal collapse.
No, of course not.
Right? Like, a bridge doesn't just spontaneously vaporize. It groans, it cracks, it sways in the wind for years. So, are there warning signs? Does this framework offer any diagnostic tools before the whole thing goes up in flames?
It absolutely does. And that is precisely what Parwez unpacks in verse 21.
What does verse 21 say?
The text states, "We will make them taste the nearer punishment before the greater punishment, that perhaps they will return." But again, we have to fight our instinct to read this through a theological lens.
Right, because the traditional interpretation paints a picture of a rather vindictive deity.
Yeah.
It implies an authority figure deciding to torture a society a little bit in this life, just as a preview or an appetizer for the massive eternal torture waiting in the afterlife.
It sounds like a petty tyrant saying, I'm going to hurt you a little so you remember who is in charge.
Exactly. It completely anthropomorphizes the universe into an angry dictator.
But Parwez's linguistic analysis absolutely shatters this reading. He explains that the nearer punishment, what the Arabic text calls Adhab al-Adna, is entirely a within-lifetime physical consequence.
Adhab al-Adna. So it's not supernatural?
Not at all.
Mm.
It represents the friction, the economic degradation, the minor institutional collapses, and the social unrest that a misaligned society experiences long before a total civilizational reckoning.
So it's systemic friction.
Yes. Parwez uses a profound medical metaphor here. He says these nearer punishments are like a fever, a severe cough, or acute physical pain in the human body.
Okay, I like this. Think about pain from a strictly biological perspective. Pain is not vindictive.
No. When you accidentally touch a hot stove, the intense pain you feel is not your body taking revenge on your hand for being careless.
Right. Pain is a vital diagnostic signal. It is a biological blessing. If you suffered from a condition where you couldn't feel pain, Your hand would literally burn to ash before you even realized you were in danger.
Exactly. Pain is an early warning system. It
Okay.
is your biology screaming at you that you are engaging in a harmful action and you need to adjust your behavior immediately.
So you pull your hand back.
Parwaz argues that Adhab al-Adna operates on the exact same principle, but for macro societies.
How does a society feel pain?
When a nation experiences a sudden spike in inflation, rampant corruption at the judicial level, localized riots, or a massive breakdown in supply chains, these are not random streaks of bad luck.
They are diagnostic signals.
Yes, the socio-economic body is registering a fever.
The system is essentially outputting an error message, saying, your operating principles are fundamentally out of alignment with reality. Adjust your parameters before you trigger a fatal crash.
Precisely.
But let me push back on this a little bit. If these diagnostic signals are so obvious, if the pain is that acute, why do societies consistently ignore them? Why'd they pull their hand off the stove?
That is the tragedy of it.
Yep.
It comes down to human ego and the entrenchment of power. As Parwaz points out, most societies aggressively misread the signal.
Misread it how?
Well, when the fever hits, instead of treating the underlying disease, which would require dismantling their corrupt structures and distributing power fairly, they just try to suppress the symptoms.
They pop a societal painkiller.
Exactly. They blame external enemies, they blame marginalized groups, or they just print more money to numb the pain. Or they distract the populace with entertainment, and they keep their hand pressed firmly on the stove.
Let's ground this in reality for a second. Think about the systems you, the listener, interact with every day. Your workplace, your local city council, your national government.
Yeah, look at everyday examples.
When employee turnover skyrockets at a company, or when city infrastructure starts failing, leadership rarely stops to say, wow, our foundational operating principles must be toxic.
No, never. They say, nobody wants to work anymore.
Exactly. Or we just had a bad quarter because of the market. They rationalize the friction. They refuse to read the diagnostic signal.
It's pure denial.
I love this concept of the diagnostic signal. Let me throw another analogy at you because I think it fits perfectly. It's exactly like the rumble strips on the side of a highway.
Oh, I like where this is going.
You know those deeply grooved lines carved into the shoulder of the road? When your car drifts out of its lane and your tires hit them, the entire vehicle shakes violently.
It makes a terrifying, deafening noise.
It is incredibly jarring. But the highway doesn't hate you. The civil engineers who designed that road didn't install those strips to punish you for being distracted.
Right, it's not a penalty.
They installed a violent physical diagnostic signal designed to wake you up, jolt your nervous system, and force you to steer back to the center of the lane before you drive off the cliff.
That is a flawless synthesis of the text's intent. The rumble strip is the Adhab al-Adna. It is a jarring, uncomfortable consequence designed specifically to prevent the Adhab al-Akbar, the greater punishment.
And in this analogy, the greater punishment is flying off the cliff, hitting the ravine, and total systemic death.
Yes. But the tragedy of human history is that a society hits the rumble strips, the whole country shakes violently, the economy stutters, and the leadership just grips the wheel tighter.
They say, wow, what a bumpy road, must be bad weather. And they keep the steering wheel locked firmly toward the cliff.
Which is madness. And that brings us to one of the most explosive and paradigm-shifting linguistic revelations in Parwaz's entire lecture.
Okay, I'm ready. What is it?
It is about how we understand the authority behind this system. Because if the system isn't an angry dictator, what is it? Parwaz completely deconstructs the traditional translation of God as an avenger.
An avenger, yeah, that's a very common translation.
The Arabic root word used in the text is muntakim. For centuries, across countless translations, this has been rendered as the avenger or the Lord of retribution.
Which feeds right back into the petty tyrant imagery. God the Punisher.
It implies a deeply emotional reaction to being disobeyed.
Precisely. And Parwaz argues that this specific translation has caused immeasurable psychological and sociological damage.
But doing what?
By instilling a paralyzing fear in the populace rather than analytical understanding. He takes us on a fascinating etymological deep dive here.
What does the root actually mean? He points out that the root action of muntakim does not originate from human courtrooms or executioners or battlefields. It comes from the ancient, harsh world of desert nomads.
Wait, how did we get from a desert nomad to an avenger? What is the connection?
Okay, imagine a Bedouin shepherd managing a massive flock of sheep or goats in the desert. The terrain is inherently dangerous. There are hidden predators, steep cliffs, toxic plants, deep ravines.
So the only safe path is the middle of the road, the established route.
Right. Now, inevitably, a sheep wanders off, it gets distracted, and starts heading toward the edge of a cliff. What does the shepherd do?
He runs after it.
He runs after it. He might shout, he might throw a stone ahead of it, or he might use his heavy wooden staff to forcefully strike the ground, or even strike the animal to drive it back to the safety of the flock.
He aggressively cuts off its dangerous path and forces it back into alignment.
In classical pre-Islamic Arabic, that specific act, the intense corrective action of guiding a straying rebellious sheep back from the edge of destruction and returning it to the middle path, is the root action of intiqam.
That is staggering. It completely slips the script. So it has absolutely nothing to do with petty, emotional revenge.
Nothing. It is purely a corrective centering mechanism.
It is an act of preservation, not destruction.
Exactly. When the consequence system acts as the muntakim, it is the shepherd forcing the societal sheep away from the cliff edge.
It is the rumble strip aggressively vibrating the tires to push the car back into the lane.
Yes. It is a mechanism fundamentally designed to save the subject from its own fatal errors.
But when human beings translated these texts centuries later, they read them through the lenses of their own feudal empires, right? Their own insecure kings, their own despotic tyrants.
They projected their own human lust for violent revenge onto the blueprint of the universe.
They anthropomorphized the physics of the universe into an angry king. And once you view the system as an angry king, you stop looking for structural solutions.
Because you think the king just needs to be appeased.
Exactly. You start looking for ways to appease the king through rituals, sacrifices, or unquestioning obedience to the clergy. You stop trying to fix the code.
You hit the nail on the head.
So when societies feel the pressure of the consequence system, when they hit the rumble strips, it is actually reality desperately trying to herd them away from civilizational suicide.
That is the diagnostic blessing.
But that naturally begs a massive question.
Which is?
If the universe provides these diagnostic signals, and if the shepherd mechanism is actively trying to push us back to safety, why do human beings possess such an overwhelming drive to fracture and destroy their own systems? Why do they keep fighting the shepherd?
To understand that, Parwaz explores the engine of reason and the factional trap in verses 23 to 25.
Okay, let's unpack those verses.
The text explicitly addresses this historical pattern. It says, "We certainly gave Moses the book, so do not be in doubt about receiving it." And they disputed concerning it.
Okay, Moses and the Israelites.
Now, Parwaz insists that we must stop reading the Quran as a collection of bedtime stories or a straightforward history book. It does not recount the story of Moses just to give you trivia about ancient Egypt or the Israelites.
It uses history as a medium to establish timeless, recurring sociological patterns.
Exactly. It is the pattern of unproven assertions. The formula is this. Every guided community at some critical juncture receives a functional framework for productive operation.
A book, a constitution, a code of laws.
Right. Something meant to align them with reality and ensure equitable survival. And inevitably, without fail, human ego, vested interests, and the desire for unchecked power fracture that unified framework into competing hostile sects.
They take a perfectly unified operational system and they just shred it.
They do.
But why? Let's really dig into the how and why here. Why take a system that guarantees safety and prosperity and intentionally break it? What is the psychological or economic incentive to destroy the very ship you are sailing on?
The incentive is the avoidance of accountability.
Accountability.
A unified, objective framework demands accountability from everyone equally. If the rules are clear, objective, and universally applied, no one is above them. The leader is bound by the same physical and moral laws as the poorest citizen.
Nobody gets a free pass.
But if a group of elites or religious clerics can fracture the framework into factions, each faction can suddenly claim to hold the exclusive, hidden, authoritative interpretation of the rules.
It's the illusion of truth masking the reality of control.
Precisely. Suddenly, the dispute is no longer about discovering the objective truth of the system. It is entirely about controlling the narrative.
If I can convince the population that my specific sect holds the only key to understanding the system, I become the indispensable gatekeeper.
And gatekeepers possess immense wealth and power.
And Parwez does not hold back on applying this critique to his own audience, does he? I mean, he goes right after the Muslim community.
He is fiercely critical. He applies this pattern directly to the broader Muslim community. He outlines how the original, unifying, radically egalitarian framework of the Quran was systematically dismantled over centuries.
Into massive, deeply hostile sectarian divides.
Sunni, Shia, Wahhabi, Barelvi, Deobandi, Ali Hadith, and countless subfactions.
The source material specifically details how these groups would literally lock the doors of their mosques to prevent rival sects from entering.
Yes.
And how this seemingly theological division regularly spilled out into the streets, leading to physical violence, riots, and the necessity of police intervention just to keep them from killing each other.
Structurally, Parwez identifies this sectarianism as the ultimate manifestation of shirk.
Now, in traditional theology, shirk is usually translated as polytheism, right?
Yeah.
Worshipping multiple gods or idols. It is considered the unforgivable sin.
That's the Orthodox view. But Parwez redefines it through the lens of systems engineering. Shirk is fatal division.
Fatal division.
It is taking a singular, unified operating system and splitting it into competing, incompatible, contradictory programs that inevitably destroy the host hardware.
But the people executing this division, the clerics, the faction leaders, they never frame it as destruction.
No, of course not.
They genuinely believe, or at least project the belief, that they are the true protectors of the system.
That is the most insidious part of the factional trap. To avoid the undeniable accountability that they have destroyed the societal engine, these groups rebrand their fractures.
They do a PR spin.
They slap a polite academic label on civilizational treason. They call these vicious, society-destroying sects mere schools of thought, or makatib effort.
Schools of thought.
Parwez points out the staggering cognitive dissonance required to maintain this illusion. You have groups actively shedding blood, declaring each other heretics, tearing the social fabric to shreds, stunting all intellectual growth.
And yet the establishment smiles calmly and says, oh, it is just a healthy diversity of intellectual thought.
It's madness.
That is just monumental denial. Let's use a corporate analogy to unpack how absurd this is.
I'm ready.
Imagine a massive tech company suffering a catastrophic systemic data breach. Hackers have infiltrated the core servers. The proprietary code is stolen. The internal network is melting down. The stock price has plummeted to absolute zero. And the company is, for all intents and purposes, dead.
A total wipeout.
And the PR department steps up to the podium and releases a statement saying, we are currently experiencing an unscheduled, highly diverse open-source data sharing event.
That is exactly what they are doing.
They are trying to slap a polite academic label on a fatal structural failure. They are rebranding a system crash as a feature.
But changing the name doesn't fix the servers.
Exactly. Calling a violent sect a school of thought doesn't stop the society from bleeding to death. So how does a society actually cure this? If the PR spin is working, and the population is comfortably entrenched in their respective schools of thought, aggressively defending their echo chambers, what is the mechanism to break that delusion?
The mechanism is reality itself.
Reality.
The consequence system is completely indifferent to your PR spin. You can call your broken engine a diverse expression of mechanics all you want, but the car still won't start.
Which leads us to the next vital concept in verse 26, right? The law of requital and reading the ruins.
Yes, because eventually reality forces the issue.
So reality is the ultimate auditor. Let's look at verse 26. It says, has it not become clear to them how many generations we destroyed before them, among whose dwelling places they walk? This establishes the concept of mukafat-e-amal.
Mukafat-e-amal, the law of requital. It is the absolute, inescapable law of cause and effect in human actions.
Cause and effect.
What this verse does is shift the evidence for this law from the realm of the mystical and theoretical to the realm of the hard, physical, and empirical. It essentially says, stop debating theology and look at the ruins.
The archaeological record isn't just a destination for casual tourism or, pretty Instagram photos.
It is raw, running data. Parwez argues that the Quran treats history and archaeology as empirical proof.
Proof of what?
Every ruined city, every collapsed empire, every shattered coliseum or buried palace you walk through is a physical data point of a crashed civilizational operating system.
This is the aftermath of the crash.
The ruins are the concrete proof that the consequence system is real, that it is active, and that it has zero tolerance for persistent misalignment.
Think about finding the black box after a horrific airplane crash. The plane is in a million pieces. It is a total disaster. But the flight data recorder, the black box, is sitting right there in the wreckage, meticulously recording exactly what went wrong.
And it has all the data.
All of it. The altitude drops, the specific engine failures, the miscommunications in the cockpit, the ignored warnings, it is all preserved. When verse 26 asks, do they not hear, it is not just rhetorical exasperation.
It is a profound diagnostic test for the current generation. It is asking, are you capable of reading the consequence evidence that is physically underfoot?
Are you analyzing the black box of history to understand the fatal errors of your predecessors?
Or are you just wandering through the ruins of Rome or Babylon or Mohenjo-Daro, marveling at the architecture while remaining completely oblivious to the systemic rot that brought them down?
We keep pulling the black box out of the wreckage, polishing it, putting it in a museum, and completely refusing to listen to the audio.
That is exactly what we do.
And this failure to read the data brings up another massive redefinition in Parwez's lecture, a redefinition that completely alters how we view the timeline of human civilization, the concept of Qiyamah.
Yes. If you thought redefining hell was radical, his analysis of Qiyamah shifts the entire paradigm.
Also,
In traditional Orthodox theology across multiple belief systems, Qiyamah, the Day of Judgment, or the resurrection, is universally viewed as a mystical, end-of-the-world cosmic event.
it is the moment when history terminates, the graves physically open, the stars fall out of the sky, and all of humanity stands before the Creator for final sentencing.
A completely supernatural event that happens strictly after human history has concluded.
Right. But Parwez takes us back to the roots again.
He does. He takes us back to the linguistic root of the word. The root of Qiyamah is Qiyam, which simply means to stand up or to establish.
Stand up.
He argues that in the context of these sociological verses, an earthly Qiyamah is not the end of the physical cosmos. It refers to a sudden, explosive civilizational revolution within the timeline of human history.
Wait, so it is a political or social uprising?
It is a systemic overthrow. It is what happens when a society becomes hopelessly stagnant, deeply oppressive, entirely unresponsive to the rumble strips of the near punishment, and fractured by those sectarian divides we discuss.
The pressure builds up within the system.
Exactly. The marginalized, the oppressed, or sometimes an entirely external force that the arrogant establishment didn't even consider a threat, suddenly stands up.
PL.
They rise up, the old structures violently shatter, and the stagnant system is obliterated. That explosive overthrow, that sudden, terrifying reordering of power and consequence, that is an earthly Qiyamah.
That is a phenomenal reframing. It brings the concept of judgment out of the distant clouds and plants it right in the muddy, bloody reality of human politics and history.
It really does.
The judgment isn't waiting for you in the sky. It is gestating in the inequality of your own society. And Parwez uses very specific historical case studies to prove this, doesn't he?
He does, and the details are crucial. He points to several massive civilizational crashes to illustrate this earthly Qiyamah. The most striking and detailed example he provides is the fall of the Abbasid Empire in Baghdad in the 13th century.
Set the scene for us,
Right.
because Baghdad wasn't just a city, it was the apex of human civilization at the time.
At its height, Baghdad was the undisputed center of the world. It housed the House of Wisdom, immense wealth, advanced mathematics, astronomy, global trade. It seemed absolutely invincible.
But internally,
Internally, the societal code was rotting. It was entirely consumed by sectarian treason, luxury, and infighting. The ruling elite were completely insulated from the reality of their own fragility.
and Parwez specifically points a finger at the leadership, right?
He specifically highlights the treacherous role of the vizier, Ibn al-Akami, often discussed in these historical contexts, alongside figures like Tusi.
What did he do?
Due to deep-seated Sunni Shia sectarian hatred, the vizier actually facilitated the empire's destruction. The historical account suggests he intentionally weakened the military and opened back-channel communications with the enemy.
So the system was fundamentally misaligned, fractured by the exact sectarian shirk Parwez described earlier, and the leadership was actively sabotaging the infrastructure out of spite.
Completely. And then came the earthly Qiyamah, Hulagu Khan and the Mongol hordes.
The external force.
Now, the Mongols were outsiders, nomadic warriors from the harsh steppes of Central Asia. The sophisticated, perfumed elites of Baghdad didn't take them seriously until they were literally at the gates.
Because they thought they were invincible.
The Mongols rose up Qiyam and swept across Asia. They didn't just defeat the Abbasid army, they utterly obliterated the empire. They destroyed Baghdad, burned the libraries, filled the Tigris River with the ink of books and the blood of scholars, and wiped out centuries of complex civilization in a matter of days.
The system crashed, and the Mongols were the fatal error finally executing.
Parwez cites other profound examples as well. He analyzes the collapse of the Muslim civilization in Spain Al-Andalus.
Which also fell apart due to internal fracturing, right?
Yes, it fell apart not solely due to external pressure, but because it fractured internally into tiny, weak, squabbling kingdoms known as the taifas, making them easy prey.
The factional trap again.
He mentions the fall of the massive Mughal Empire in India, hollowed out by corruption and lethargy, and he points to the fracturing of the Ottoman Empire after World War I.
The pattern is relentless. In every single case, a society believed it was invincible. It ignored the internal rot of factionalism, it silenced the diagnostic signals, it drove right over the rumble strips, and it was suddenly met with an explosive, violent overthrow. An earthly judgment day.
The black box of history all plays the exact same audio.
So if a society wants to avoid this Qiyamah, if it wants to actually align with the consequence system and thrive rather than burn, what does that practically look like? How does a society code itself for success?
That takes us to the systemic counterpart of the fire, the systemic reign and the Persian encounter.
Okay, let's get into that.
This is where Parwez shifts from purely diagnosing failure to vividly illustrating the output of true alignment. What happens when a human system actually functions correctly?
What's the historical example he uses?
To demonstrate this, he uses a powerful, paradigm-shifting historical anecdote from the early days of the Islamic expansion, involving the second caliph, Umar, and a captured Persian governor named Hormuzan.
Consider the geopolitical mechanics of that era for a second, because the power dynamics between the Persians and the Arabs in the early 7th century were drastically different than anything we could easily conceptualize today.
Absolutely. We have to completely strip away our modern map. The Sassanid Persian Empire was a massive, ancient, hyper-sophisticated superpower.
They had centuries of imperial history, vast administrative wealth, heavily armored cavalry, and a highly structured, rigid class system.
And the Arabs, on the other hand, were a fractured, disorganized, nomadic tribal society struggling for survival in a harsh, resource-poor desert. The Persians viewed them with absolute, unvarnished contempt.
The source material mentions that the Persians thought fighting Arabs was literally beneath their imperial dignity. When the initial Arab envoys arrived, the Persian commander Rustam supposedly mocked their ragged clothes and offered them bags of dates to just go away.
It was considered a source of profound shame to even deploy a professional army against them. It was the equivalent of a modern nuclear superpower being annoyed by a disorganized street gang.
But then, an earthly Qiyamah of a different sort happened.
Within a shockingly brief period of time, just a few years, these disparate desert nomads unified, surged out of the desert, and completely dismantled the Persian Empire at battles like Al-Qadisiyah. The superpower was shattered.
Which brings us to the pivotal encounter between Caliph Umar and the captured Persian governor, Hormuzan.
Right. Hormuzan is brought to Medina as a high-ranking prisoner of war. He is brought before Umar, who is essentially the leader of this new victorious system. And Umar doesn't gloat.
What does he say?
He asks Hormuzan a very direct, analytical, systems-level question. He essentially says, Hormuzan, you Persians used to consider us beneath contempt. You had all the wealth, the weapons, the history. We were nothing. What changed? Why are you standing before me in chains?
He's directly asking the vanquished engineer for the data from the black box.
Exactly. And Hormuzan's answer is a brilliant, crystalline piece of socio-economic realization. He doesn't blame the weather, and he doesn't claim the Arabs used dark magic.
What does he say?
Hormuzan says, before, when we fought, it was just Persians fighting Arabs, and because of our resources, we were stronger. But now, we are not fighting just Arabs, we are fighting Arabs plus their new framework.
Arabs plus their system. Let's pause on that word, framework. System.
Yes. Hormuzan, as an administrator, realized that the Arabs had not magically become biologically superior, nor did they suddenly invent superior metallurgy or weaponry.
What changed was their civilizational operating system.
They had adopted a unifying, equitable, highly disciplined framework, the Quranic system, that eradicated their internal, energy-draining tribal warfare, established the rule of objective law, and aligned them with productive, forward-moving principles.
So the Persians were not beaten by superior muscle. They were out-engineered by a superior infrastructure.
Exactly.
I love how profoundly rational this is. There is zero magic involved. It is a pure, demonstrable infrastructure upgrade. Let's use another analogy to really cement this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine two neighboring kingdoms in antiquity. Kingdom A is situated in a relatively lush, fertile valley, but they rely entirely on unpredictable seasonal rainfall. They are complacent.
Okay.
Kingdom B is a barren, disorganized desert. Kingdom A laughs at Kingdom B, but then Kingdom B undergoes an intellectual revolution. They invent and install a flawless, hyper-efficient, technologically advanced irrigation system. They harness the rivers, build aqueducts, and manage the water perfectly.
So they completely changed their infrastructure.
Right. Suddenly, that barren desert is producing 10 times the crop yield of Kingdom A. Kingdom A isn't defeated by sorcery. They are bankrupted and absorbed because Kingdom B executed a superior infrastructure upgrade.
That analogy perfectly mirrors the frequent Quranic metaphor that Parwaz highlights next to explain this exact transformation.
The metaphor of rain, right?
Yes, the text consistently uses the metaphor of pure rain striking dead, barren earth. Traditionally, theologians read this merely as a proof of God's ability to resurrect dead bodies in the afterlife.
Right, the standard reading is, He brings the dead earth back to life with rain, so He will easily bring your corpses back to life from the grave.
But Parwaz brings it firmly back to sociology and human development. The dead, barren, impenetrable earth in this metaphor represents a stagnant, fractured, uneducated, and unproductive society, exactly like the pre-Islamic Arabs.
And the rain.
The rain is not just physical water, it represents the introduction of a functional, aligned framework, a divine revelation that acts as a flawless socio-economic blueprint.
So when that rain strikes that barren society, and the society absorbs it,
the result is an explosive, unstoppable harvest of human potential.
The irrigation system is turned on, and the yield changes the world.
Exactly. The Persian Empire, for all its wealth, was stagnant. It hadn't absorbed new rain in centuries. It was locked in a rigid caste system. The Arabs absorbed the new framework, and the resulting harvest of intellectual, military, and social power was something the old, calcified empires simply could not compute.
Hormuzan realized he wasn't beaten by men. He was beaten by the math of an aligned system.
Yes.
This is such an empowering way to look at human history. It completely removes the determinism. It implies that any society, no matter how barren, disorganized, or impoverished, can achieve that explosive harvest if they undergo the intellectual rigor to adopt the right operating principles. It is entirely systemic.
It is empowering, yes. But it also carries a terrifying, unyielding warning, which brings us to the culmination of Parwaz's lecture in the final verses of Surah As-Sajdah, verses 28 to 30.
Because just as true alignment brings explosive growth, persistent denial brings an inescapable finality.
The no-exit clause.
The no-exit clause, exactly.
In these closing verses, the opponents of this new framework, the entrenched elites who are profiting off the broken system, are mocking it. They say, when is this victory you keep promising? If you are truthful, when will this happen?
And the Arabic phrase they use for this victory is Yom al-Fath.
And Parwaz drops another major linguistic redefinition here, doesn't he? Because faith is a heavily loaded word in Islamic history.
He does. Traditionally, faith is translated almost exclusively as military conquest, the physical domination of a territory, or defeating an enemy in battle. Think of the conquest of Mecca.
But Parwaz takes us back to the root. He argues that the core meaning of faith is simply the opening of doors. It means the removal of obstacles.
That is a massive philosophical distinction. True victory isn't about crushing the opponent into the dirt. It is about clearing the path forward.
Precisely. In a truly aligned system, fourth means removing the artificial barriers to human progress, human dignity, and intellectual development. It is about unlocking the doors that oppressive systems have welded shut.
But the disbelievers in the text are mocking the timeline.
Right. They are essentially saying, when are you going to conquer us? When is this big event? But the text responds with a chilling, absolute warning about the nature of the consequence cycle.
What exactly does the text say in response?
Verse 29 responds, say, on the day of faith, the belief of those who had disbelieved will not benefit them, nor will they be given respite. Parwaz explains this strictly through the lens of systems engineering.
The consequence cycle is currently running.
Once that cycle reaches its absolute finalization, once the fatal error is fully executed and the civilizational system crash physically begins, trying to hastily claim alignment will not save you.
You cannot hit Control-Z while the hard drive is physically melting into slag.
Exactly. If you spend your entire life, or your civilization's entire epoch, building a society on exploitation, ignoring the rumble strips of the Adhab al-Adna, dismissing the diagnostic signals of poverty, unrest, and ecological collapse.
You cannot suddenly shout, "Wait, I believe in equality," the moment the oppressed rise up and tear the city gates down.
There is no exit clause. The system does not accept last-minute verbal apologies or superficial conversions when the physical consequences have already materialized.
Let's synthesize this whole arc, because asking when is the judgment, as the mockers do, is entirely the wrong question. It implies the judgment is some dormant, scheduled event waiting quietly on a calendar.
Which it is not.
If we go back to the gravity analogy, it is like intentionally jumping off a 100-story building. As you are plummeting past the 50th floor, the wind roaring in your ears, you yell to a physicist watching from a window, "Hey, when is gravity going to punish me?"
And the physicist looks at you, bewildered, and says, gravity isn't waiting to punish you at the bottom. Gravity is actively running right now. You are inside the consequence system already.
Exactly. The fall is the consequence system. The sudden, violent stop at the bottom is just the finalization of the code you executed the moment you stepped off the ledge. You can't yell, "I believe in the laws of physics," 2 inches before you hit the pavement and expect the universe to generate a trampoline.
There is no override.
That is precisely the chilling note on which Surah As-Sajdah concludes. The final verse, verse 30, tells the messenger, and by extension you, the listener, to turn away from them and wait. Indeed, they too are waiting.
The timeline is left deliberately open.
The text does not give a specific date for the civilizational crash. It just confirms that the physics of consequence are active. Both sides, those aligning with the framework and those stubbornly clinging to the broken system, are waiting for the physics to play out.
So bringing all these threads together, this lecture by Ghulam Ahmad Parwez takes a text that has been treated for centuries as mystical, post-mortem theological poetry and reveals it as a rigorous, unsentimental mapping of systemic alignment versus fatal denial.
It establishes that the productive laws of a successful society are not arbitrarily invented by politicians. They are discovered, much like the laws of thermodynamics.
It outlines how humans build structural traps like borders and factionalism that manifest as an earthly hell.
It redefines divine punishment as a vital biological diagnostic signal, the rumble strip desperately trying to save us.
It demolishes the idea of a vindictive God, replacing it with the shepherd mechanism of the Muntakim.
It proves the inescapable law of requital through the empirical data of archaeological ruins.
And finally, it confirms that once the consequence cycle is finalized, there is absolutely no exit clause.
And it leaves us with a profound, unavoidable responsibility. If the system is currently running and there is no override, then every social, economic, and political choice we make is either aligning us with the reign of progress or pushing us closer to the explosive Qiyamah of our own making.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought to leave you with.
Yeah, let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time today talking about reading the ruins of past civilizations, examining the black boxes of Rome or Baghdad or the Ottomans, and seeing exactly where they failed.
Right.
I want you to imagine our modern, hyper-globalized, technologically advanced society as an archaeological site being dug up 1,000 years from now. Future historians are brushing the dirt off our massive server farms.
They are analyzing the remnants of our militarized border walls.
Yes. Our biometric locked gates, the bizarre, grotesque disparity of our wealth, and the digital records of our endless, vicious factional disputes.
Based on that hard, physical, empirical evidence, what will those future historians say were our actual operating principles?
Not the beautiful PR statements we wrote into our constitutions, but the actual compiled code we ran every day.
And more importantly, as you look around your world today, which diagnostic signals, which violent, deafening rumbles on the highway are we currently ignoring?
Which structural fevers are we writing off as just a string of bad luck while the steering wheel remains locked firmly toward the cliff?
It is a terrifying question, but it is an absolutely necessary one if we want to grab the wheel in time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the raw mechanics of the consequence system. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep reading the data in the ruins, and we'll see you next time.